Hello, welcome to the LaRouche PAC Weekly Report from May 9th, 2012. I'm John Hofel, and with me in the studio today are Cody Jones and Ben Dennison of The Basement, and Lyndon LaRouche. Good morning, Lynn.
Good morning. I just put a subject of a thesis before you here. It won't be stated fully in this remarks made today, but I want you to have it in mind because it's a coming issue which of some importance. It's called The Great Hypothesis. It's the title of something I'm writing, and the emphasis is the following. We assume mankind as in the flesh, yet mankind's function in the universe is not to be in the flesh as such. Man's function in the universe is the creative powers of the human mind, which may be called the Great Hypothesis. We've come to a time of testing in which the threat of extinction of mankind lingers over us from Britain and from similar kinds of places and from our own president. We're within weeks of the potential of the end of civilization. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying the potential is aroused, is dangerous. And we have to think in terms of higher considerations than usual. We have to think of what it is we have to save, what it is we have to defend, fundamentally, but not in the ordinary sense. We have to save what the meaning of the human species. We have to put aside all kinds of little cheap issues which are really not important. Our question is, we're trying to save mankind by bringing mankind out of the kind of operation which we are a victim of under this President of the United States and his British and kindred folk. So this is something which I shall be taking up in an article which will be forthcoming and so forth, and it pertains to the higher function of mankind's mind. And that's enough on that. But I want the theme to be understood there, and I shall be responding accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just start by first introducing a bit of a counter theme that I think will then set us up to go into the main point that you're making here. And I just want to mention a particular figure who really is the embodiment of everything which has been wrong with the last 100 years of history. Someone who you yourself had deemed the most evil man of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell. And I bring him up because his ideology, the ideas that he spawned, really are at the core of all that we see wrong in the world today, from the types of systems that are applied in economics, the games theory idea of economics, to what we're seeing now with a refocused thrust from the oligarchy around the ecology movement, the environmental movement, the idea of lowering the population in the name of saving the environment. This, again, was an idea whose, at the core, the ideology behind it is something which Bertrand Russell is wholly responsible for developing. And you see that all the way to then what we have culturally. Russell is one of the key players in pushing the counterculture movement, the Frankfurt School movement, the CCF movement. Now, what you have with Russell, what does this come down to? It comes down to an attempt to try to do, again, in sort of the modern era, what you had with Euclid in his attacks against the Greek ideology, against the idea of the Greek idea of a noetic universe, where you had with Euclid brought in by the networks of Aristotle into the Library of Alexandria to effectively run the mathematics department there, where he pulled together all of the work of the Egyptians, the Greeks, the classic scholars on geometry, on astronomy, and other things, codified it, and turned it into this bastardized reductionist system. And then, maybe by accident, but seems somewhat convenient, the Library of Alexandria burns down, you lose much of the original works, and all you're left with is this bastardized Euclidean version of what had actually been real creative discoveries. So you had a very similar kind of thing happening with Russell when he tried to produce this piece of garbage, this Principia Mathematica, which was really an attempt to say we can take all knowledge and we can reduce it down to one logically consistent system. where it will be one language that will somehow deductively give us all truth in the universe, all reality. Now, of course, Gödel came along and showed just how completely insane that thing was. But it was a certain methodology employed by Russell, which says creativity doesn't exist, change is an illusion, and somehow we can create one system which will forever capture the totality of reality in the universe, that we can then just deductively we can deduce all of that which will happen into the linearly extended future from this one system. That then became the model for what we've seen in systems analysis around the development of the ecology movement. It became the thinking that was behind the development of game theory with economics, which has really been the thing dominating, the economics of this last century. It also became the ideology behind just what you have with social processes. The idea that you can map out all social interactions like some kind of giant computer network. This is something we exposed in a writing we did some years back, is the devil in your laptop, where we showed how this whole social control process was occurring through computer systems, the internet, social mapping, all this kind of stuff. And so all of this really comes out of this policy of Russell's, which is to effectively take creativity, take that which is uniquely human out of the equation, so to speak, and try to create a system which, once adopted by the population, can be wholly controlled by this sort of elite, this mathematical elite. Now, if you step back and look at what they attempted to do, you actually see how wholly insane this is. I mean, it'd be like saying, we're going to take up a study of fish, but we're going to ignore the fact that they have gills. And that's exactly what they did in, say, looking at life or looking at mankind. We're going to look at life, but we're going to ignore that which is the fundamental characteristic of what a living process is. Namely, we're going to ignore the idea that life is characterized by a principle of anti-entropy. Now, they might, in their complex feedback loop systems, generate an effect which seems to have an anti-entropic effect, but they'll just say, well, that's just an epiphenomena. That's just a localized, short-lived seeming phenomena which seems to counteract the second law of thermodynamics. It seems to counteract entropy, but it's short-lived and it's occurring within a system which itself is bound by entropy, by the second law of thermodynamics, what have you. What we've been doing, what we've been demonstrating, is that if you're going to investigate life, you have to actually investigate what the fundamental characteristic of life is, which is what Vernadsky did, to show that life is in fact the antithesis of the second law of thermodynamics. It runs completely contrary to the idea of entropy. That what you have with the principle of life is a universal principle of anti-entropic directed development. And we see that, we've depicted it in this cone heuristic, which we've presented a number of times.
Right. Yeah, to take it to what Lynn opened with, to now step back and look at everything you're raising here, and I think to address how Lynn opened this whole discussion, just to really continue to pose the question of what is the human species that we're talking about that has the power to make this effect you're discussing here, and to really put that as the primary issue that's actually being discussed in this whole discussion. We'll talk about Nawapa, the defense of Earth. We're at a point where the crisis is as much a question of can we get mankind and the leadership of mankind to come to a new realization of what is the true scientific nature of the human species and what is the true scientific nature of the universe that produced the human species. And, just to take the work that we've done, I think it's even kind of funny to use the term species to describe mankind. I think even that's kind of an irony. Because if you take everything we know about what defines a species as a species, that breaks down for mankind. That what defines a species as a species is this, if you look at this history of life, is this fixed ecological relationship. That is the characteristic of an animal species, is its biologically determined relationship with the biosphere. If you look at life over a longer period of time, you get these evolutionary upshifts, this increase in energy flux density of life, of the biosphere. But that doesn't happen as a function of a species. That happens as a function of life as a whole, right? Interacting with the whole galactic system, with the solar system.
Right.
But what do you see with mankind? You see a potential that is not biologically defined. That what characterizes mankind, the powers to do these things we're talking about, is a power that's explicitly not biological, that's above biology. Mm-hmm. It defines a power to transcend what biology can do. The characteristic of the human species is an anti-animal characteristic in that sense. We have a biological component, but what characterizes the human species is ability to transcend species. And this is so the human species is not defined by simply our biology, our living characteristics. So that's obviously a part of how we exist. Mankind is defined by our cultural, scientific state. And if you take Lynn, your work on economics, and you take this question of energy flux density as a very important correlative of this process, or if you're talking about mankind, if you're talking about a chemical-based mankind, that's different than an atomic-based mankind. If you're talking about mankind coming to dominate and understand and control fission, fusion, and eventually matter-antimatter processes, you're talking about a completely new quality of mankind. And so you take what we're looking at now, which has been, as you were saying in a discussion with us last night, and it's come up a number of times, you look at the state of humanity now, since the entry of mankind into this thermonuclear mode, where thermonuclear power is now at least a characteristic defining the characteristic of mankind. And you take the power that represents. You take the crisis now. What we're looking at is if mankind continues in this mode of oligarchical warfare, if we continue the type of cultural activity we've had for the last thousands of years of attempted suppressions of populations, Bertrand Russell's explicit policy of using wars and famine to control populations, we're at the point now where because of the human creative advance of the human species, that if we continue this type of cultural mode of action, this type of warfare mode of action that's inherent in this oligarchical system, we're at the point where we now hold the power for the self-destruction of the human species. Mm-hmm. That we're at a point where the continuation of that mode of action, as we're seeing right now with the current threat from Obama acting with the British, with these weapon systems and these ABM systems in Eastern Europe, the Ohio-class submarines in the Pacific, we're looking at the potential for the elimination of the human species as a function of this power. Because you have to look at the human species as defined by this characteristic. Mm-hmm. But then that also holds a big irony, because not only we're looking at mankind now as the potential to potentially destroy ourselves if we continue this mode of action, but we're looking at, for the first time, getting a real sense that mankind can actually continue to exist in this universe. That this same power, this same power of thermonuclear capability, this idea of mankind entering the atomic age in the fullest sense, exhausting fission, pursuing fusion, moving towards matter-antimatter, and having that define the power of mankind, for the first time we're looking at a capability to defend the entire planet Earth in a way that no other animal species has ever been able to do. So you're looking, on the one hand, the potential for self-extinction is a possibility. But at the same time, you have the potential for actual continued existence.
Well, this is the same thing I call this the great virtual hypothesis. Mm-hmm. That we operate on the planet now, in cultures now, on the presumption that we are locked in to a sense of the order of priorities that we use to describe man's power on Earth. Mm-hmm. And we find that what we do is we assume all of these ordinary things, that we start from the lowest level of experience, we go to a higher level of experience, and that's the limit. And that's the end. But then on the other hand, we find when we look at the universe as we know it, look at some of the things we are able to determine, we find that the usual assumption that you start from simple sense perception and on your way up, and that's your system, that is completely absurd. It's not true. I mean, it's absurd to assume that we start from the simplest form of life or the simplest form of existence and go to a higher form of existence, and that this happens in the way we assume, by pragmatic methods. It doesn't happen. That actually the universe functions from the top down. That is, the human mind is the most powerful thing we know in terms of its potential in the universe. If we extend the idea of mind to all the things that correlate with mind, then we go down to lower levels, which we're considered, you start with inorganic material. You go to a lower form of life, which you assume is organic material. You go to a still more rare species, which is animal life and so forth. And you assume that mankind and the creative powers of mankind are the most infrequent, the most improbable of all experiences.
Right. Standard reductionist view.
Exactly. But this depends upon taking certain measurements you make and assuming these measurements are defining the universe. But then you turn around and you get to the magnitude of what the solar system is and beyond the galactic system is. And you realize that the creative powers, which are expressed by these orders of magnitude, are actually the controlling powers. That the highest form, the most efficient form of expression, which we know of in the universe, it correlates with the creative powers of the human mind. So therefore, we put man as being the weakest, least probable form of thing, and we go down to the cruder things of non-life, and things of forms of non-life, and we find these are the most frequent things, and that living processes are a minority of inorganic processes, and so on and so up the ladder. That the creative powers of mankind are treated as the rarest, weakest, and most vulnerable aspect of the process. But this is an assumption. And what we find in the functions of the universe, if we take what we're discussing like here so far today, if you look at these processes and the scale in which they operate, you say, wait a minute, but these kinds of processes are high energy flux density processes are the most powerful thing in the universe. So why are we on mankind saying the contrary? Why are we saying the things the lowest energy flux density in terms of per unit of measurement? And when we know that the human mind corresponds, the human creativity corresponds to the most powerful force we know of. So we're making a simple assumption and taking the frequency of we encounter material unit of area, and we assume that the thing is ordered in that way, that the lowest forms of expression are the most fundamental, and the only creative being that we know of on this planet, the only creative being of living is mankind. Its creativity, as defined by Vanatsky, for example, typifies what we're looking at when we look at mankind. Because human creativity is more powerful than other forms of life. Life is more powerful than non-life in terms of energy flux density. So obviously we start with an absurd assumption, and we take the most powerful thing we know is the human creativity, and its implications for the planet is the most powerful thing we know. We were talking about what you present and what you've done here. The same thing. We're talking about the great virtual hypothesis that the universe is the universe, and what controls the universe, what subsumes what we know as the universe, is in this direction.
Right.
It's what we call a hypothesis, a creative hypothesis.
Right.